So good morning, everyone. My name is Al Season. I'm Vice President at RTCA. I want to add my welcome to all of you who have joined us today. And I've been reminded by the moderator of the panel that this is the day the Caps celebration is going on for their win. And we scheduled this. They did not coordinate their celebration schedule with us, shockingly. So we apologize that you can't make both, but we're glad that you're here. This panel is going to be on drones in the UAS, and if you look back into the past, this is the third panel, third year that we have offered a session on drones and the remarkable progress that the technology has made in those just 3 years and 5 years, 10 years, where drones were considered to be a DoD asset and nothing more. But I think one of the most important things about drones, and one of the great evolutionary steps they've taken, is also in the acceptance by the public. They're beginning to lose their mantle of being a disruptive technology. And so when we formed this panel, we asked the panelists to think about how can we move the drones into the next level. The view of drones is beginning to calcify where they fit within the aviation architecture, and is there a disruptive technology that's necessary to get them to the next level? And so to introduce, I'm very pleased to introduce Sean Cassidy, who is the Director of Safety and Regulatory Affairs for Amazon Prime Air, and I'm going to turn it over to him, and he'll introduce the rest of the panelists. Sean?
Great. Thanks so much, Al. And I'd like to start by reiterating my bitter disappointment that you scheduled this event while the Capitals are rallying downtown right now. How could you get the time? No, but seriously, but thanks for the intro, and I appreciate the participation of the panelists, and I all know this is a topic that is of a high degree of interest to everybody in this room, make no doubt about that. We only have 50 minutes, so this is kind of like our version of speed dating, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to go into some brief introductory remarks. And then we're just going to go right into the Q&A phase. Unfortunately, given the time, we're not going to be able to take any questions off the floor, but we all have plenty of stuff to talk about, and I think the way these things work great is where you have a lot of spirited interchange between the panelists, and I have no doubt that will be the case. So starting to my left, beginning with Mark Blanks, who came from Kansas State, and now he runs the Virginia Tech Test Site, the Mid-Atlantic Partnership, and doing great work as one of the proponents, overseeing one of the test sites, and also like to congratulate Virginia Tech and the site for being one of the awardees for the DOT White House Integration Pilot Project. To Mark's left is a good friend of mine, Tim Knoll, who I had the privilege of working with back when I was at the Airline Pilots Association. Tim is the current president of ALPA, where he represents over 60,000 commercial pilots in both United States and Canada, and a great voice for the commercial piloting aviation. Todd Gratz, to Tim's left, another person that I seem to run into almost weekly out here in DC at various rulemaking committees and standards boards and everything else. Todd is on point. He's in charge of UAS operations for Burlington, Northern Santa Fe, and of note also is at BNSF is one of the Pathfinder programs for FAA, where they are at the very leading edge of establishing risk cases and operational use cases and demonstrating that beyond visual line of sight operations can become a reality, and they can become a reality safely. So thank you for your efforts there. Kevin Stone, another person who I've worked with quite a bit, came from the National Association of County Officials, and now he is in charge of the National Association of County Engineers, representing 2,500 engineers around the country, many of who, as you would probably guess, with construction work are also involved in things like surveying and leveling and infrastructure inspection. And then finally, Matt Zuccaro from Helicopter Association International. Matt is one of the few folks probably around here who has 10,000 hours as a helicopter pilot. That is a pretty darn notable achievement, going all the way back to the 17th Air Cav in Vietnam. And surprisingly, he also represents a bunch of folks who are also not only helicopter pilots, but are also getting into aerial robotics. So thank you so much for joining us here today. So one of the things that I noticed this morning when I was having coffee and getting ready to come in was I turned on the TV set to the news piece the very first thing I see is a drone commercial. It happened to be for Chevron, and it was talking about this wonderful uses for infrastructure inspection, safety inspection, and also helping crop surveys and the like. And I think that's pretty emblematic of the way that this industry has really turned the corner from even the word drone being looked as somewhat some insidious and insipid kind of term to something that's rather commonplace. And the numbers prove this out. Back when Matt and I and others were on the initial registration task force, when they first opened the doors, they had estimated that there would be a few 100,000 registrations of operators. Well, that number just surpassed 1 million last year. And indexed to commercial operations between 2018 and 2022 for non-recreational and non-hobbying use, they're estimating right now that the growth is going to go from approximately 150,000 registered non-hobby use commercial operations to over 450,000. And that's based upon the FAA's latest forecast, their aviation forecast report that they update every year. So what I like to do is actually talk about the things that we all have in common. You know, I look down the line here and I think about the fact that I just flew back and forth to Seattle and I just happened to run into somebody from my alma mater, Alaska Airlines, and the flight attendant was starting a drone photography business. And he had all kinds of questions about, you know, how does the new rulemaking work? What are the safety issues and everything else? And lo and behold, the pilot also has started up. It was one of the original applicants for a Section 333 exemption, which granted commercial operating rights, also doing a photography business. Looking down the line, I look at somebody like Kevin from the county engineers, and I think about all the different kind of use cases that are at play right now that take care of the 3Ds, the dull, the dirty, the dangerous operations. And then even over at Matt, you would think that somebody representing the Helicopter Association would have kind of a secular view in the world. I can tell you from talking with Matt extensively, anything but. Think about how many of his constituents are actually going to be engaged in aerial robotics programs using drones and UAS, in addition to the legacy kind of things that they have going on. The other thing we also have in common is an unyielding commitment to safety. And I look down this panel and I can tell you that I'm gratified at the participation that we have from all the folks here, from the Unmanned Air Safety Team, which incidentally is actually meeting this week out here in DC, to rulemaking. Matt was the industry co-chair for the Remote ID and Tracking Rulemaking Committee, to the stuff that's happening out at the test sites in developing interoperability standards and the like. But again, the one thing that all really does unite us here is safety issues. Looking a little bit forward in terms of the rulemaking that has been accomplished so far, we've done a lot. You know, the Part 107 operational rule came out in the summer of 2016, and it unlocked literally thousands and thousands of use cases which enabled operators to primarily operate visual line of sight below 400 feet, but included an awful lot of different use cases that we just talked about before. But the question is, right now, going back to Al's introductory comments, have we gotten to the point where we really are poised to catalyze all these use cases and go beyond the corner cases right now, beyond visual line of sight, operations in controlled areas, and operations in the areas of airspace, which traditionally you don't see a lot of unmanned operations, other than probably some of the public use cases that we see right now, for instance, from Department of Defense. Have we gotten to the point right now, or in the near future, where we are beginning to look at these use cases not so much as disruptive, but something that's complementary to the current applications right now? So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists in a second, but I think, like I said, it's kind of interesting. You would think that there would be all these kind of secular views in the panel, but we do have a lot that actually unites us. We do have a common interest in safety, and I think that we all have bought into the notion that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it comes to these integrations of unmanned systems in the airspace. And I would argue that this is probably one of the most transformative things to happen to the world of aviation, probably since the advent of the turbine engine. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tee off one of our first question. I'll toss it out to the panelists. I invite open conversation, rebuttals, and the like. Those are always the panels that seem the most interesting. So I'm kind of maybe thinking about a conversation I just had with Todd right before it kicked off. And basically, let me tee it up by saying, okay, so now we have this first phase of integration of UAS into airspace operations. What is the impact to legacy aviation, and what has manned aviation had to do to kind of adapt currently and will have to do to adapt in the future? So I'll just toss it right out there.
Well, I think one thing we noticed as we were talking, Sean, is that we find ways to interact with manned aviation on a more frequent basis than we originally expected. So we just completed activating another 300 miles of a linear corridor between Winslow, Arizona and Belen, New Mexico. And you'd think in these rural areas you might not see a lot of air traffic. Combining that with the other two areas, we have over 700 miles of linear routes that we're flying BVLOS, at least every other day, and sometimes in the same day. And even more so, we have several more corridors that the FAA would like us to equip, again, to show how we can fly for hundreds of miles at a time, both from a flight control center that's headquartered somewhere near the flight region within 200 or 300 miles, but also on Monday we successfully essentially grabbed an aircraft out of the sky that was flying just south of the Canadian border up in northern Montana and operated that from our flight control facility in Fort Worth. So with all this flying, we're finding the obvious things, right? We're trying to prove there's value, there's a return on safety, it'll enhance the way we can inspect our infrastructure on a large scale basis without adding human occupancy to the infrastructure. But we're also learning the fact that in the middle of nowhere, quote unquote, there is a lot more general aviation and even in some cases commercial aviation air traffic below 500 feet than you'd expect. And it's what we've learned from building essentially our own ground-based surveillance network, in combination with we get the services from the FAA, and we supplement that, of course, below 500 feet, because a lot of times there's no separation services provided. We're finding a very high frequency of interactions, positive interactions, thankfully, all positive, but surprising number of operations. So we're pushing that. We're trying to educate the general aviation population. We have an outreach program before we activate subdivisions, but it is surprising to me that the amount of pilots, not just flying, but the amount that don't read a NOTAM, maybe don't have a recent VFR chart, are on the wrong CTAF channel. We're squawking, we're talking on CTAF, or in the case of Class D on the tower channel, wherever we're at. But it's surprising, and I think that's this next iteration, is that operators like us are out there, and we're still in the research phase with the FAA, but we're out there, and now we're finding we're kind of rubbing up against that, I guess, wall. And I don't want that to be a negative, but the fact that the common thing we hear from the other pilots is, gee, no one ever flies out here this low, and I didn't expect anybody to be out here. And so I think that's really how we're helping with integration. I think that's going to be the next area that we all find in this industry, is that cohabitation in airspace that otherwise would not have seen it.
Anybody else care to comment? So I'm looking at Matt, and also one of the conversations we just had briefly was the fact that you're this interesting kind of juxtaposition of folks that have these kind of legacy kind of manned aviation, but also a lot of your members are getting involved in kind of more kind of robotics and UAS-oriented operations. How are you kind of contending to these things internally within the association, which is now kind of having to flex to accommodate both?
Yeah, it's been an interesting period for us for the last several years, and about 5 years ago we started addressing unmanned aviation, and we thought about it a lot. And there's two roads you can go down. One is to challenge the technology and try to keep it out of the airspace. That's not a logical plan, not in our eyes anyway. We embrace the technology. We think it's exciting. We think it's a business opportunity for us, quite frankly. And we thought when you look at the operating parameters and missions that the drones are going to fly, that's us. We're really the only aviation segment that is consistently on a day-to-day basis 500 feet or less. And we're in the vertical reference mode and doing a lot of hover work, and so do the drones. And we're also doing the missions that are being acquired by the drones. We're doing utility type work which easily adapts to a drone aircraft taking over that mission. And rather than looking at it as a challenge, we looked at it as a business opportunity and felt that there's a potential here for us to expand our value and our services offered to our customer base by getting in the drone business. And we feel we're the resident experts at it because all of the things I just mentioned, it's our world. We do it, we're used to it. And we started adapting that aggressively. And inside of HAI itself, we're doing this on a U.S. domestic and international basis because our membership base is international. And what we found is that there are approximately 55 missions that helicopters do. And none of them are similar. And it's kind of unique from the airplane world in that airplanes generally operate airport to airport. You know, and what we're doing is everything from landing at places that nobody's ever landed before, pick up patients on hospital helicopters. We're fighting fires. We're going 200 miles out in the ocean, landing on rigs. We're doing rooftop operations. I mean, the list is endless. And that's all potential territory for drones to either replace or assist. And that's not a profane word. You know, we can live with replacing the helicopter on a mission, and we intend to be the operators operating that drone. And the logic to that too is based on a little on your statement, which is true and which I really appreciate, is that everybody's focused on safety.
Yep.
How do you safely integrate these new technologies into the airspace? And we feel that we have a good chance to make sure that happens if we're operating the helicopters and the drones, because we have systems already set up focused on safety. But the integration to us, we kind of simplify it, to be quite frank. If you look back on the history of aviation, we've spent you know, over 100 years integrating class and category of aircraft into the airspace. I mean, you started out with the balloons and the gliders and the airplanes and obviously helicopters and paragliders, and you name it, it's up flying now. And ultralights, and we view this as another category of aircraft that's going to enter the airspace. You have an existing system. Why reinvent the wheel? You know, you have structured airspace that they can be integrated into. We have certification standards for aircraft and crews, pilots, owners. We have rules of the road, and I think that would tend to contribute to the safe integration, and we already have a formula for it, and I think it'll work fine. And we're optimistic. We're looking forward to it.
You know, seizing on that safety theme, and I'm looking at Tim, back when I was working with Tim at the Pilots Association, one of the things that we always addressed was the interaction of drones and unmanned aircraft and also commercial operations. And the high level takeaway was, look, we weren't certainly not opposed to it as long as they could be integrated and done so safely. And fortunately, that message really hasn't changed very much, even moving over to my new job at Amazon. So kind of thinking in terms of the kind of commercial pilot's perspective, in envisioning safe integration, what are kind of the gaps and the challenges that have to be broached into safe integration in shared airspace?
That's a great question, and you're absolutely right, Sean. We don't see many gaps in the commitment to operating safely. But there are some gaps, especially from my members' perspective. We're always in controlled airspace, right? We're flying airport to airport. And from my members' perspective, there's a great amount of angst in that we have no control over this issue currently in the cockpit. We see them show up visually late. These are nonconformists, right? We're not talking about your guys. These are people who have blundered into the airspace, right? They've nonconformists of whatever type, hobbyist, commercial, whatever it is, they ended up in the wrong spot. And the challenge here is the risk is very high to the whole industry should we smack into an airplane and have a loss of life in particular. So from our perspective, the most profound thing we need is some form to get the pilots in the game. Get them in the game to help the see and avoid equation, and that's ID and tracking. That's ID and tracking. And quite clearly, it needs to be ID and tracking for everyone. So whether you're a conforming operator or a non-conforming operator, your vehicle shows up so the airline pilot on approach into Kansas City knows there's somebody out there right now that I need to be on guard for on approach. We just don't, you know, Sean's comment was to the point. It's not a matter of if, It's when we're going to hit one of these things. And I'm afraid that all the hard work that we've all done to ensure that we keep advancing will grind to a screeching halt if we have a loss of life due to a drone impact with a commercial airliner with passengers on board. So it's incumbent on all of us to be thinking about ways to convince our legislators primarily to ensure that this ID and tracking, when we finally get a rule, can be deployed across all vehicles. Because not everyone can control their drone. There's lost link, there's flyaways, there's all sorts of things. We need to know about that. And we need to get the 4 eyeballs in the airplane helping us do that. And the only way to do that is to display it electronically.
So I'm looking down the line at some of the participants. Any comments on the ID and tracking as far as?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that statement. We're not where we want to be now, and we have conflicts. I'm comfortable saying that we have a great working relationship with the commercial operators. Quite frankly, to be blunt, we're not worried about Amazon or Google or the other people that are going to operate commercially. You're going to do it the right way. You share our vision. What we are worried about is the people that go and buy them, take them out of the box, charge the battery, and okay, off we go. And that's a gap. And I can speak from experience from our membership, certainly, in that we have had EMS helicopters on approach to hospitals with patients in the back, and the next thing they know, they look up and there's a drone in the windscreen on the final. We've had firefighting operations that are going on, and we've got 20, 30 helicopters involved in fighting major fires that are approaching, populations and structures. And there's a drone, and they have to shut down the entire firefighting operation. When we've investigated and they found out where it came from, it's never been somebody that has an operating certificate and is a commercial operator. It's somebody who's just bought a drone and thinks this is neat and is getting great videos of all this exciting action. That gap has to be filled, and it's kind of ironic because 3 weeks ago I testified at the Senate on this very issue, and our concern is that Congress in the 2012 Authorization Act had left a gap in the regulations that the FAA was not supposed to regulate hobbyist and recreational drones. And I'm like trying to get my head around this. How do you tell the regulatory agency not to do its job on the biggest segment of the drone population? They by far outnumber the commercial operators. And finally, after some effort by a lot of people, they're changing that, and they're starting to get that regulation back in and allowing the FAA to do what it's supposed to do and do its job. And all we're saying is, it's an aircraft that's in the airspace with the rest of us, and the people flying and operating them should be under the same rules and regulations that are adapted for drones, of course, but they should be certificated, they should be trained, the aircraft should be in an airworthy condition, and there should be ID and tracking. I don't think that's asking a lot. Right.
So on the topic of remote ID, I think it's obvious that it's kind of the linchpin right now for a lot of the different use cases we want to see. The concern that I have, though, is that remote ID is a hard problem. It's a very hard problem, especially if you look for the 100% solution. So what I would like to see is some type of active push to get something that's better than what we have in place as quick as possible, and then we can improve upon that. But it doesn't have to be a 100% solution tomorrow, and right now we have nothing. So, there's ASTM has a standards group now working on remote ID, and I'm sure that they won't solve that problem in 2 months. But I think we can rapidly get something fielded that can start to solve the problem, as long as we're not focused on a perfect solution.
So I'm going to kind of tug on that thread a little bit, because with all the work that you're doing, Mark, with the test site operations and with the technical capabilities level trials that are conducted with NASA, an upcoming UTM pilot project, and of course the integration program that was started by the White House, it's a very kind of green field and lots of lessons to learn and lots of things that can be achieved in terms of informing future rulemaking and operating guidelines. So we talked about remote ID, and obviously I would agree, we also work together on the remote ID working group at ASTM, as a matter of fact. We're going to be together tomorrow down there. But in addition to that, what are some of the other learnings and things that are going to be kind of the deliverables that come out of all those programs that you're engaged with in terms of rulemaking and guidelines and operations?
So there's a whole alphabet soup of programs out there. It seems like P is a common thread these days, so UPP, IPP, PIPs. Anyhow, all of those programs have their own unique objectives, their own unique targets. And I think you could dwell on each one and say what the outcome should be. But to me, I see all those programs as basically answering questions, as long as the questions are asked, and as long as they're asked appropriately. We a lot of times get trapped in this circle loop of we need more data, we need more data. The test sites are supposed to provide data. The IPP is supposed to provide data. The UPP, same thing. But the data really only matters, and I really actually hate that term, because data means a lot of different things to different people. But data could be rephrased as answers. So we're looking for answers to specific questions. And for the regulator to do their job, I think they need to be asking the right questions, which I think they are asking many of those right questions, and seeking ways to answer those questions, and using the mechanism and the tool that makes the most sense to do so. So when I see the impact of what those programs are and how they impact rules and guidance and policy, I see them as answering those questions. But if it's about the safety of an operation, or the usefulness or validity of a risk mitigation, if it's a target level of safety or a community's acceptance, those are all answering individual questions. There's a lot of questions right now about what the community role is and how the local communities play in this. And I think, to me, it's really a question of what is the appropriate level of transparency and education that's going to take to make them engaged, to get them involved, and to make their participation positive. So just to sum up, I think our focus should be not on finding data to support rulemaking, but on answering specific, discrete questions to the best of the ability as we can right now.
So I haven't forgotten about you, Kevin, because this feeds perfectly into the world that you live in right now. So it's kind of interesting place because you represent county officials and county engineers and the like, and there's a lot of very prominent use cases that we discussed a little bit earlier, and you're really kind of at the leading edge of where this kind of tension exists between airspace rights and also sensitivity to place, manner, and time of use, right? And so you have a very in-demand use case, but also have to be responsive and sensitive to the communities that you serve. So how do you strike that right balance between those two kind of sometimes conflicting concepts?
Sure, it's fascinating. As I listen to my colleagues, their remarks, I find myself nodding my head in complete agreement about 98% of the time, and then all of a sudden I hear where the disagreements lay. So first, let me just lay out a basic, as Mark was saying, our, whether they be engineers or elected officials, absolutely embrace the technology. Nobody is against UAS implementation for any purpose. Like you said in the introductions, the safety aspects of UAS are countless. When I go on the road and speak to groups, from the electeds, the questions are never really about enforcing laws. They're, how can I keep my residents safer with drones? How much do they cost? It's a real education type question as opposed to a frustration with what the federal government or commercial industry may be doing. But where I think the problem or the crux of the issue that I know we've had as a group and dealing with outside policy stakeholders and policymakers is definition of airspace. When Matt says the uniform sort of rules and regulations blueprint for all aerial, whether they be helicopters, airplanes, whatnot, I think that's where there's a major disagreement at the local level and my colleagues, where we feel that UAS technology can do things that an airplane cannot. Can do things that a helicopter cannot, can do things that a hot air balloon cannot. And for that reason, we as elected officials would like to have some skin in the game in terms of regulating that ultra low altitude environment. Helicopters can't weave through houses 50 or 30 feet above the ground in a crowded neighborhood. Airplanes certainly cannot, and hot air balloons I don't think would want to. And we find that there's privacy concerns, there are safety concerns, just public nuisance concerns, and local officials have no interest in regulating one iota the national airspace. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't afford it. But what they do want is to be able to deal with the questions from their constituents. Much like you were saying earlier, the Amazons and the Googles of the world, the FedExes and the UPSs, absolutely no issue with them whatsoever. They're not the worry because they're going to do things professionally and responsibly. What we worry, like was being said before, is the one-off, is the person who could go out and buy that drone and do things that they shouldn't be able to do with it, which they couldn't possibly get their hands on a helicopter, couldn't possibly get their hands on an airplane, couldn't possibly get their hands on a hot air balloon, but they can go get their hands on a UAS very easily. So local elected officials feel that there needs to be some sort of mechanism, which we don't know exactly what that mechanism is, quite frankly, but a mechanism to be able to enforce laws and keep their constituents safe. Because all of the good stories we do hear about drones, unfortunately, can be wiped away by one bad story, which the press will harp on, which then forces electeds to act hastily.
You know, there's a lot I agree with there, with the exception that drones can do things that the manned aviation can't. That's absolutely true. But the converse is also true. Manned aviation can do things that drones can't do, yet we're operating under a single set of rules. So I'm not sure that that's a discriminator, and I do know that it has worked for manned aviation. To your point, though, Scott, I totally get it, because the Drone Advisory Committee took up Task Group 1 to look exactly at this issue. And I sit on the Drone Advisory Committee, and it was, you know, it was a good exercise. Let's just stay with the positive. It was a good exercise. But that's the extent of it. We didn't have any expectation this was going to solve any problems, because the courts are struggling with this issue as well. The fact that we're talking about it is the best thing we can do, right? To get the locals talking with the federales, so to speak, and see if there's something we can do while we map this out. Because it's still maturing faster than we can even contemplate where it's going. And that's the part that we should all be really focused on.
No, I would absolutely agree. And in the short time that I've dealt in this space, one of the very first things that the National Association of Counties, as far as their policy blueprints for UAS was not a single rule or regulation, but simply to have a seat at the table. Yeah. To be involved with the Drone Advisory Committee and the subcommittee in Task Group 1. And without any preconceived notions of what laws should or shouldn't be, but simply just be in the room when these decisions are being formulated, and through the DAC and through the DAC subcommittee, advisory committee subcommittee, we feel that we've actually had a place in that discussion. Now, it's no secret we haven't always gotten along with our colleagues in those task groups and subcommittees, but we're very appreciative for the chance to be able to contribute and hopefully impress upon everybody that education is the single biggest ally that industry and government has in terms of local governments. Education in what drones can and cannot do, what your mission in terms of utilizing drones are. The preconceived notions are out there, and you have a wonderful opportunity to dispel the wrong ones and promote the right ones, because a flourishing UAS community equals a flourishing community. It's an economic driver, it's a safety innovator, there's countless positives. But without the education, baseline education from folks that are not engineers, per se, elected officials, that are not pilots, that have absolutely no idea what 107 means, it's a golden opportunity for you to work with your community stakeholders and drive towards a blueprint that's going to work together. That's why we're so excited about DOT's IPP, is because you're really going to get these real-life laboratories that can maybe create some of these rules and regulations that were contributed not only by local governments, but by their private stakeholders as well.
So,
Go, Mark.
Oh, go ahead.
let's get Mark, then you, Matt.
Yeah, good.
Just to build on that, because it was a great point, especially in the context of the IPP and talking about communities and their involvement. There's a lot of talk about place, manner, and time restrictions and about who can fly when and where. Luckily for us, the Commonwealth of Virginia has a preemption on that prevents localities from doing that, putting those restrictions in place. But I really think the conversation should not be about restrictions. And what is the right level of restriction? I think the conversation should be about what is the right level of education, what is the right level of transparency. The main concerns come when you don't know who that guy is flying across that you can see over your backyard. If you knew that aircraft was at 300 feet, had no camera on it, and was delivering a package somewhere, or delivering your next iPhone that you probably want, you might actually like to see that there. The idea of focusing the conversation on what the right level of restriction on, I think, bypasses the very legitimate transparency and education that needs to happen. And it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy to educate the general public, but it's probably going to be easier than putting in place this very, very diverse set of restrictions all over the country that nobody could understand or comply with. So I know our goal is really to work on the transparency and education piece of it and make the interaction with the public positive in every way, shape, and form, and help they will perceive the value of what the technology can bring through innovation to them.
I agree with pretty much everything you just said, and you should have a place at the table. You're a stakeholder, just like the rest of us. We understand that. And when I said common regulations, that's a philosophical statement. It's not a technical statement of all the regulations are the same for everybody. It's already built into the system. If I want to go fly a sport airplane, I have one set of regulations. If I want to fly a helicopter, I have another. If I want to do a balloon, if I want to fly airlines, all different regulations, different requirements, different operating, permissions and definitions. And my point to that is, I agree with you. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I'll admit, I haven't been between houses with a helicopter, and I don't intend to be. But I think the drones can. So that's an issue that separates them from the rest of us, and you write a regulation and a policy procedure that addresses that type of situation. So it's not like one for all. It's tailored and it's very specific. The other element is we deal on a day-to-day basis with local municipalities, towns, and villages, just because of the work we do. We're landing within your town, on buildings, on people's front lawns, on corporate headquarters, wherever. And we're very sensitive to that. And we have the utmost respect for land use authority for towns, villages, and states. You have the right to say whether you think it's okay for us to land on a piece of property in that town. And we know we have to go through the whole zoning process to get a heliport or to make that landing. But when we lift off the ground and we're in the air, we really feel strongly we need the confidence that there's a unified agency that controls all the aviation activity. And that's really why preemption exists. It's why the Airline Deregulation Act exists. In order to have that unified, common regulatory oversight that's provided right now by the FAA. And we're a classic example. An average mission for us is to do a utility line patrol and repair. We might run 100 miles of high tension lines in our work and doing it at 500 feet or less. I might pass through 30 municipalities or counties. Am I supposed to know what everybody has as a regulation or whatever? Because if you breach the line with drones, to us and we've had the conversations already, the next step is manned aircraft, and we know that. And we really feel that all the stakeholders, us included, should be sitting at the table. But when that conversation ends of all the stakeholders and we've all had our input, that one agency has got to step back and do what they think is best and make that regulation. And that's all we're saying, is let's keep the authority of the FAA singular and we all get our input and we respect that. Because we've got aggressive fly neighborly programs, community outreach. We meet with mayors and city councils and the citizens every day of the week on our routes and where we do and where we fly. And we actually adjust our operating procedures, altitudes and routing in order to address those concerns. So I think, we're kind of saying the same thing, but we just feel, well, let's not fragment the regulatory system. That would be dangerous. Yeah.
I think the single biggest issue that we've had is, and you nailed it, 1,000%, is the slippery slope concerns.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can speak for the 3,000 counties and the 2,500 plus members of the county engineers. When I say definitively that county governments have zero interest, nor the capability, quite frankly, to get into the manned aircraft game. I can't spell that out. Period. End of sentence. I can't stress that enough. It ends with drones. There's no reason, nor affordability for local governments to get into the manned aircraft regulatory. It would just be impossible. And another thing you said is absolutely perfect as well. When you say you have these wonderful relationships with local governments, utilizing buildings and whatnot, and hospitals, emergency response. Where the issue that local governments come into is because we know 10 out of 10 of your members are responsible professionals who aren't going to abuse that privilege and that right. Where again, anybody can get up from this table right now, go over to Best Buy, buy a drone and start flying. And they can go some of the same places yours can. And we have no idea who that is. We have no idea where that came from. We have no idea what's attached to it. And that's where the problem lies. The responsibility that you impress upon your members and that you should be complimented for just doesn't exist at the level where the accessibility for the UAS aircraft is.
And they can buy that drone, but they cannot fly it in D.C. Just editorial comment here. So, Tim.
It's a great discussion because it's really what we've battled for a while. No interest in the manned aviation except for the fact that they'll be flying with us. In the same airspace. There's one transition thing I'd like to, because Mark brought up some good points about transparency. I really think that's important. The mitigation of the risk, even during the data collection phases, needs to be more transparent than it is today. We don't, in manned aviation, we spend a lot of time collaborating to ensure that we understand what each other are doing to mitigate each risk. We're not seeing any inviting of us into this discussion on the mitigation on this. Yeah, I understand there's proprietary things. A lot of these entities are in these programs to make money. Get it. Well, look at least at my union, over 34 companies bargaining with each and every one of them on an individual basis. We know how to keep proprietary secrets. So I think that's something the unmanned aircraft safety team should be looking at. And the other thing they should look at is the recommendation that came out yesterday from the Academies of Science with regard to how the FAA approaches this. I completely agree. The association agrees that this should be a holistic view from the FAA's point of view. We should get out of our silos and look at this holistically. I think that's a great way to go at it.
One of the things, there's been a common thread to this last about 10, 15 minutes of conversation, and that's the transparency, communication, education, and everything else. And let me just kind of give kudos to RTCA for kicking off the Drone Advisory Committee. And let me kind of compare and contrast some of our experience with the Next Gen Advisory Committee. In that case, you had a cadre of individuals that were pretty much on about the same step in terms of their background, their knowledge, their industry experience. Not so with the Drone Advisory Committee. Talk about a very, very diverse and complex challenge, taking 30 different stakeholder groups from all kinds of walks of life and trying to baseline their understanding of an industry that's on the move daily, with new use cases daily. And I think that, and again, kudos, I realize things are changing, but that was no small task to kind of get this dialogue going and actually to unearth some of these kind of discordant notes and kind of figure out how we could resolve them. Case in point, I totally agree with what Tim is saying in terms of let's get this data coming, let's get this performance data that validates the safety case, that informs regulations, that shows interoperability, but let's do it in the most transparent manner possible, and also doing it with certain kind of checks and balances in place, such as what's happening with the test site programs. Todd, such as what's you've been able to achieve with Burlington, which is absolutely amazing.
It's been possible because of all the common, the commonalities we have, right? The dedication to safety, the fact that we have a known flight area, right? We know where we're flying, and thankfully we don't have to change sets of rules every city, county, state. I'll put that back in there. But we've had some success, but it's because I think we're pretty unique in the fact that we represent and have to deal with all the challenges that many of the other stakeholders that we work with on the DAC had to deal with as well.
So we have about 1 minute left. I was going to ask my last question, but if I do that, then we're going to be talking for the next 2 hours. The question was, what does the world of UAS look like over the next decade? I'll let you think. That'll be your inside voice that's going to answer that question. Maybe you can do it during the break. But I want to keep us on time. So again, hopefully you enjoy the conversation here. Thank you so much for your participation, and I'm sure we'll be seeing each other around town very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.